where are you leading us with your crack, Kingy?
Well, let's just have a look at some vision of the Sydney Swans at their absolute best. And we saw them at the start of the year move the ball at will. That short kicking game, Joey, that you've shown a few weeks back, where they just slice through everything at angles. Everything's an uncontested version, if you like. And these three have been huge. Heaney, Goulden and Warner, we've talked a lot about those guys. And the rest are the support staff. We saw Blakey last week go crazy. But most of it was with ball movement. And this is where they are the big threat for me. And I'm just looking at this, and most changes that happens to teams at the top of the table are subtle rather than dramatic. They're just small shifts. They're not dramatic falls off the face of the earth. And when you look at the ladder and you look at the gap between the top team, the second team, and then that little gap back to third and so on, I think the ladder lies a little bit. I don't know if the gap is as big as what the ladder is telling us at the moment. And I'm looking fairly at the Sydney Swans. And I think if you want to look at their counter-attack game, their turnover game out of the defensive half. So just take away the numbers from that forward 50. Talk about ball movement, if you like. So this is what they were, 0 to 10 versus the last 6 weeks. Defensive half turnover, they've gone from 1st to 11th. They're not massive shifts. It's only a goal or fractionally more than a goal. Not winning the ball back as often. So opposition teams are getting through. And when you talk about punish, which is what we have spoken about with these guys, give them the footy and you bleed. Defensive half start of the year, best in the comp. Bang. Through you in a heartbeat. You're disorganised. You're gone. Well, teams are attacking them differently now. When you sit at the top of the table for this long, you get picked apart. They take away some of your uncontested game, whether it's handball receive or uncontested marks, and force you to play a different way. So they go from 1st to 9th. There's their uncontested mark drop. That's a dramatic number, 15. You take away the forward 50, so it's just the ball movement zone of the ground. So all I'm saying is just keep your eye on this, because if you can reduce one mode of the Swans, you challenge them to find it somewhere else. And the gaps in the game are not that big. So they are subtle. Let's recognise them and appreciate them for what they are. I'm not saying they're going to fall off the face of the earth, but what I am saying is, after this long at the top, you get picked apart by the top 4 or 5 contenders and they start disarming you and taking things off you. So they've lost 20 uncontested possessions a game. Doesn't sound like a lot, but most of the time those possessions are going back to Goulden or back to Warner or back to Heaney.
You only have to look at Collingwood last year. Remember the exact same thing happened. Collingwood were flying, and then they had that patch through the middle where teams were figuring them out and they really dropped away.
Which makes sense.
It does make sense, and they had to find another mode. And then we know that the gap was very, very small come finals time for Collingwood in the end for them to get that premiership.
So it's not dramatic. They're just subtle, and it's a long period. And maybe sometimes you can do things by design. I don't necessarily see this as that being the case. But when you look at the individual, so we go to the key three, Heaney, Goulden, Warner, and the drop-off for Heaney is just slight. It's not a lot. So score involvement's all we talk about. Is it from stoppage? Is it from turnover? So down 20% from stoppage, down 20% from turnover. So they're only small shifts. So then you pass that responsibility to someone else. You look at Goulden. Goulden's the one that's really spiked, Joe. We've talked about this guy a lot. So he's probably their most damaging of the three at the minute, because on turnover he's fleet of foot and he's out and gone, and he can play a whole host of different roles. So he's probably the most difficult one in terms of positionally to clamp at the moment. And Warner, he's still around the same mark, but down a fraction on turnover. Kicking the lights out when he hasn't shot a goal, but his field kicking has gone right off. So I'm not saying they're going to fall apart. I'm not saying it's dramatic, but right now it's subtle. So if we look at the in 4 weeks' time, we might see just a real tightening of those top 3 or 4 teams.
Fascinating watch, and for Swans fans, they probably September can't come quick enough at the moment. Well, speaking of the ladder, each week we look at the ladder and see how it could change, and you could just about pick between one of 4 or 5 games, couldn't we? But the game over in Adelaide, it really shapes the 2 significant changes. Could be a tip changer in a way, couldn't you, really, with Liam Jones and Cody Waitman after his big week coming out of the team. Let's hope they're not as flat as that. But Port Adelaide got their win last week, so what could happen one way or the other?
Well, if we take a look, if Port Adelaide get the win and we see what it means for them, I mean, they can jump up to 6 and the Western Bulldogs then all of a sudden are 6 points out. So essentially 2 games out of the 8, and it makes it difficult for the Western Bulldogs. So that's going to be a big one.
So that's if the other favourites win.
That's if the other favourites win, is how we're structuring it, as it would be expected with the other results. And then if you flip it around, and if the Western Bulldogs, as you touched on, even though they've got some injuries to key players, if they are able to win, they can jump into the 8, and they're making their move. And Kingy, you've been strong that they will play finals. The Western Bulldogs, it'll be a big scalp to knock over Port Adelaide in Adelaide, and then they'll get some players returning.
Big scalp. It's a huge game, and they're all going to, like we said last week,
Yep.
there's going to be a dozen 8-point games in the run home, and we normally have probably 4 or 5. I reckon we have 2, 3, 4 times that amount. It's going to be an unbelievable finish, and I think the ins and the outs are going to matter. So that's why tonight's really critical. And I think when you go to the coaching conundrum and have a look at Rory Lobb, and can he do it again? It's a big question, and we've only seen it once, so no one's trying to get ahead of things. But there are a few moves in the game that have premiership impact, and this is one of those. So you know that Jones is out obviously this week. I know you touched on that before. With him not being there, he becomes a significant part now. He becomes the one-man wall down there. Can he do it? Can he hold up? I've got no idea, but let's just say he does. And I think it'll be one of the coaching moves of the year to not spend, to use a pawn in essence, and not a power piece to cover this role. 12 intercepts last week, 5 of those marks, and they scored from his intercept marks. That's the gap. You often can get an interceptor, but you don't really score from them. 13 points last week. I think the average from those intercept key defenders is about a goal a game. So to get that sort of return's big.
Yeah, it is, but the security blanket of Liam Jones not being there is significant because now the leadership of Lobb, who hasn't really played in defence with Carmus and O'Donnell, that's a bit more inexperienced. So it's going to be a big watch, but you're right, if he can stand up without Liam Jones there again, it could be a masterstroke.
What if he does it and then you get Harry Mackay the next week? What if he can, Joey?
Yeah.
Well, I think you've got to look at it in a real positive sense at this stage.
Yeah, well, it's a test. Obviously, it was against North last week. He steps up against Port this week. All right, the Red Rooster crunch time. Kingy, who's at crunch time for this weekend with thanks to Red Rooster?
I'm going to go take over. I'm
Right.
going to go.
Taking
I'm on the
almost.
crunch time.
What do you got
I'm
this
going this
time?
time.
Okay,
I'm putting it the crunch times on the
Righto.
Cats and the Cats again down at home, and it's their midfield. Because there's been a lot of talk about the midfield for Geelong this year, but they can't continue to do what they've been doing, and that is be really poor at their clearance game. Now that Dangerfield is back, I mean, on the weekend it was Dangerfield, Tom Stewart, Atkins. That is not a midfield that should be getting smacked around clearance. Now, they did okay against Essendon, but it is something they need to work on because they've lost 7 of their last 9 clearance battles. And why that's important is because then they don't really score from them, so their scoring off the back of it is poor, and they're 14th differential, right? So that's for the year. But they're coming up against a Hawthorn team that are absolutely flying in the clearance game over the last 8 weeks. So they have gone from being, from round 0 to round 8, they were the worst team in the competition at scoring differential from clearance to being the second best. They are flying at the moment. And the reason why it's important, down at GMHBA, it's a clearance ground. To be able to get field position is important because it is so skinny. So every team that's won the clearance battle so far this year down at Geelong has won the game. So Port Adelaide and the Giants got a hold of Geelong in the clearances and scoring from clearances in those games, and that's why they were able to set it up and win at home. So now it's over to Geelong to be able to find a way to stop this rampaging young Hawks midfield and be able to take away their scoring and firepower, because it has been the biggest reason why they've won 6 of their last 7 games, and from the, as we touched on, from the clearance game. So can the Geelong midfield do it? Can they break even at least or try and win it? They just can't get comprehensively beaten in there because we've seen their defence is still a bit shaky. It'll put them under pressure and it'll make it hard for them to transition the ball against the Hawks, who are setting up defensively really, really well.